technical glitch when I got dropped out, but it seems like it is being recorded. I see a little icon here.
So it's going now. Yeah, it's going now. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, great. So yes, the meeting will be recorded, and the recording is usually shared. We're also trying to ensure that it's going to be shared via Facebook. We're just checking the technical side of that at this point in time. So welcome all, and thank you for joining. This Food Governance Community of Practice Dialogue is going to be focusing around food price dynamics during the C-19 lockdown, and to look at what the implications are for policy and governance. And we've pulled together a really interesting group of speakers today. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of that, I'd like to just bring your attention to some of these protocol suggestions here. That speakers who are not speaking should please turn off video and keep mics muted unless you're actually speaking, just to ensure that we economize on bandwidth and that we avoid any interruptions. Then if you are speaking, particularly in terms of comments and questions and answer later on, please keep it quite brief and to the point. We have 2.5 hours in total, and we are trying to cram in a lot into that. And this also applies to our actual speakers and panelists. So we are going to keep a fairly tight eye on time. And so I'd like to encourage everyone to just keep it really focused and to not get carried away. Then use headphones if you can to avoid feedback. And if you feel like making a comment or adding something during the question and answer session, the dialogue session later on, please use the raise hands function in the I think it's in the chat or in the participants window. You'll be able to let us know that you want to speak. And then the topics that we discuss here are sometimes controversial, and there may be fairly different perspectives and positions. So I think it's important to allow space for disagreement, and at the same time, we'd like to encourage a polite and respectful tone throughout. And then, yes, the meetings will be recorded, and if everything is working well, they will also be streamed on the Facebook page of the Center of Excellence. Okay, so here's an overview of our proposed agenda, and you will see that we've put in fairly precise times. We don't expect to stick exactly to the times, but these are indications which will help us to keep on track a little bit. As you can see, the presentations feature 3 presenters. Mervyn Abrahams from Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Group, Jason Naprosky from the Competition Commission, and Andrew Partridge from the Western Cape Department of Agriculture at Elsenburg. And we've asked each of these presenters to just speak to the data and the findings around food price changes during lockdown. And we're going to be hearing presentations that are showing different kinds of data coming from different places and using different methodologies. And I think this is part of our interest, is to understand those methodologies and what the data is telling us, what the implications are in terms of food insecurity, in terms of access to healthy and nutritious food, but also in terms of the governance options, and particularly governance options for local and provincial government. Then we have a group of panel respondents, Rafiwe Jwala from PLAS, also involved with the C19 People's Coalition, and has collaborated with the Center for Competition. Sorry, I don't know CCRED exactly what it stands for. She's also recently written an article around food price monitoring. Rashida Muller from the South African Informal Traders Association, Alliance, sorry, who will be representing the perspectives of informal traders. Marlene Lowe from the University of Pretoria Department of Agricultural Economics, who also works with Bureau for Agricultural Policy, BFAP, I believe that's what it stands for, who've also done quite a bit of price monitoring, and I think also have a sense of what's happening upstream from the retail space. And then Francois Niles from the Agricultural Produce Agents Council. He's the registrar of that organization and has quite a deep insight into the dynamics at the fresh produce markets across the country. After that, we'll be moving into an open dialogue. So anyone who feels to ask questions or make comments, this is the time when we can chip in. So the panel respondents, we've asked to reflect on the presentations, not to present themselves. So we're hoping that that's actually going to kickstart the conversation, and we welcome critical engagement, and then the dialogue will pick up from there. We've allowed about an hour for the dialogue, and then we'll be wrapping up with a little bit of information about other recent developments and opportunities to collaborate going forward. Okay, so I think it's useful just to contextualize the conversation in terms of who we as the Food Governance COP are and what we represent. And so the community of practice is really a group of people who've been coming together for about 3 years now to develop a network to exchange information and develop knowledge around food governance. And so we're comprised of academics, of officials, of civil society activists, and of citizens who have an interest in these matters. This particular COP we've pulled together as a result of COVID lockdown. We've no longer been able to host local communities of practice gatherings face-to-face. So we've migrated all of that online and have amalgamated essentially the Western Cape and the Gauteng communities of practice, but there are also representatives from other provinces that occasionally join in. We're certainly interested in extending those networks further. So this is really an open platform, and we invite participation from anyone essentially who has an interest in food matters, and particularly in the governance of food matters. And when we speak about governance, I think it's important to distinguish that from government, where government represents more closely the state. Governance recognizes that there is power through, distributed across society. And so that these different stakeholders need to be also involved in participatory and open and democratic deliberations that can inform food policy and food governance. And it is an initiative that's also, in the broader context of social learning and of various other initiatives that are also pursuing a similar kind of agenda of democratizing food governance. And those who participate more regularly are actually, considered actual COP members, but there's a broad periphery of people who've been dipping in and out. Okay, so we've had several previous gatherings this year. The first one was on informal food trade. That felt quite urgent because with the beginning of lockdown, informal traders were quite severely affected. Many lost their livelihoods, and also the food access channels to the particularly poorer parts of the country were disrupted. We also participated in a Cape Town Food Vision meeting with ICLE, which was submitted and was unfortunately not successful, but I think helped to articulate a vision for the city going forward. We've since had a gathering on civil society organizations and their role in emergency food aid. We've had another gathering on urban agriculture and its potential contribution to managing food security, particularly under COVID. And I just want to point out that there's been a big issue publication which discusses this particular topic in more detail for a more kind of broader public audience. And then the last gathering we had was on waste in the food system and what the policy and governance implications are in that space. All of these themes are intended to contribute to the development of a set of policy briefs, which were commissioned by the Cape Higher Education Consortium. And so we have an audience waiting to hear for any kind of recommendations that come out of our deliberations. So I think the key point of what we're working with is the idea of knowledge co-generation through multi-stakeholder dialogue. And there are multiple opportunities to contribute going forward. Most of our conversations are framed conceptually within the notion of food systems and food environments. Food system being all the different relationships, stakeholders, and activities taking place between the farm and the dinner plate and beyond that to waste. So that includes the production, the processing, distribution, retail, preparation, and disposal. And then food environments essentially form an interface between this broader diffuse food system and people's actual households. So it represents the actual spaces people live in, work in, and how food appears in there in terms of what's there, what's available, what the prices are, and so forth. And the diagram on the right from Turner et al. Outlines that a little bit more. So we're interested in seeing what the different governance levers are that can be used to get a handle on food systems and food environments so that these can move to a more sustainable and more equitable, more resilient space. And more importantly, also a space that ensures adequate nourishment for all, particularly those who are vulnerable, including young children, elderly, and the disadvantaged. So having said all that, I'd like to invite Mervyn Abrams from PMBEJD to kick off. They've recently launched a new methodology and a new price index of retail prices of food. So Mervyn, please go ahead. I'm going to stop my share and you should be able to share your screen.
So good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Florian. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to prepare a presentation, so I won't be sharing a screen.
That's fine.
But we will be sending, for those who do not have, I will send copies of our October Household Affordability Index. A little bit of background to the index. Since June of 2018, we have been tracking the prices of a basket of food in the Pietermaritzburg area of KwaZulu-Natal. And our methodology is that we have conversations with women in low-income households in order to work out and discuss with them what it is that they try and purchase at the end of each month or during the month, what food, in what quantities, and which retailers they would go to. So it is to get a sense of food purchases, prices within low-income households. And the women who collect, our data collectors, are women from low-income households rather than university students or academics. And so we have been doing that since June of 2018. And in April of this year, we decided to expand our data collection to include the Metro of Johannesburg, to include the Metro City of Cape Town, eThekwini or Durban, and Springbok in the Northern Cape, because we also wanted to get a sense of what prices are like in small towns on the periphery of the major routes and logistical routes of South Africa. And so we piloted that process for 5 months. We collected data, had conversations with women in these areas. And in September, we released the first of our expanded household affordability indexes. To give you a sense of exactly where we collect data within these cities. So in the Johannesburg Metro, we collect data in Soweto, Alexandra, Tembisa, and Hillbrow. In the city of Cape Town, we collect prices, or at least women within Gugulethu, Philippi, Khayelitsha, Delft, and Dunoon, and they collect prices. In eThekwini, it is from KwaMashu, Umlazi, Isipingo, and Durban Central, as well as Matuba just on the north coast of KZN, and then of course in Springbok and in Pietermaritzburg. So essentially we collect data around food prices, a particular basket of 44 foods, quantities for a household of 7. And we collect these prices from roughly 44 supermarkets and 30 butcheries across the areas where we collect data. I won't go into every single item in our basket, but I think it is probably useful to mention some of them. And so in our core staple foods, we have maize meal, rice, flour, sugar beans, samp, cooking oil. And then we include milk and Mars and eggs, and we have some meats, chicken pieces, chicken feet, chicken livers, beef livers, inyama, yangapakati, which is more the insides of the cow. And we have a little bit of fish. And then we have vegetables like potatoes and onions and tomatoes and carrots and butternut and spinach and cabbage. And then other items that is necessary for meal preparation. So salt and curry powder and soups and cubes, stocks and tea, tinned pilchard canned beans, and for bread, margarine, polony, white bread, and brown bread. And so there are 44 of these foods in the basket. And so just to now go across to pricing. The first thing I want to say is, with our focus on COVID, is that in our Pietermaritzburg basket, because unfortunately our the expanded basket that has Johannesburg, Durban, and Cape Town, of course, we only launched it in September, so we do not yet have historical data over long periods. So we can only do month-to-month increase, but not yet year-to-year increase. But in Pietermaritzburg, we can. And so when we look at our Pietermaritzburg basket, we will see that during lockdown, the prices of our basket increased by 293 Rand and 38 cents, or 9.1% over the past 7 months. And it is interesting to note that a major part of this increase, in fact, took place between the as from the second week of March, so just when the lockdown was announced, to the first week of April. And that is significant because it was during that time that the Department of Trade and Industry and the Competition Commission came out to say that they will be watching price gouging very carefully. And then we saw a kind of continued increases, but at a much slower rate than within from the second week of March to the first week of April. So in terms of interventions, we would say that intervention was useful at that moment in order to ensure that food prices did not increase at the same trajectory as it did right at the beginning of the lockdown period. If I could then go to just give an indication of the prices of our basket across the different centers as at the end, or our October index rather. So our October index for the city of Johannesburg, so within that area, stands at 3,969 Rand and 41 cents. In Durban, it is 3,907 Rand and 62 cents. In Cape Town, 3,920 Rand and 86 cents. In Pietermaritzburg, 3,709 Rand and 92 cents. And in Springbok in the Northern Cape, that exact same basket cost 4,034 Rand and 53 cents. And so we have averaged our index across these areas, and the average price is 3,916 Rand and 72 cents. In October, the main drivers of the price increases on the basket was maize meal, sugar beans, cooking oil, potatoes, and brown bread. Those were the main drivers of the increase. And then we had a slight decrease in the price of frozen chicken portions, but extremely slight. Because our entry point into food prices really is around the question of affordability, we believe that tracking the prices of a basket of food that low-income households attempt to purchase every month, should they have sufficient income, is an indicator of the level of the affordability and the financial crisis that low-income households experience. And so for us, the entry point then of importance is to compare these prices with household incomes. And when we look, for instance, at the income for a national minimum wage, at the end of October, it would bring in 3,653 Rand and 75 cents. So that would be a national minimum wage if the worker worked every day of the month. And if we compare that national minimum wage to the price, to the average price of our basket, which is 3,916 Rand, then of course we realize that the household cannot purchase that entire basket. So what then happens is that women then go through this whole process in the store of what should we drop out of our basket because we cannot afford that. And generally women tell us that what they drop out of the basket would by and large be vegetables and fresh produce, and things like milk and eggs, and some meats will be dropped out because they cannot but buy the core staples. They have to buy maize meal, they have to buy rice, they have to buy flour, they have to buy cooking oil, etc. And so this is the reality for many women as they have to manage this process of continued price increases. And in particular, the prices that increase the most have been the prices of the core foods. So when that prices increase, then of course the level of nutrition drops out of the basket. I think I've spoken for almost my time, but I will be available for more questions around what does this mean furthermore. But if I could just conclude by one thing, that because it's an affordability issue and it is an income versus prices, we have to, our main advocacy position in our October index have been that it is absolutely incomprehensible how the state could drop the top up to the grants at this particular point when the COVID-19 economic devastation continues to have an impact on households. And when that top ups are removed at the end of October, we are predicting the possibility of increased hunger amongst low income and working class households. Thank you so much. Thank you, Florian. I think till that point for me.
Hi, I think we have lost Flo, which is unfortunate, but we can continue without him. So can I ask Jason if you're ready to present, and I will find out where Flo has dropped to. Would you like to share your screen?
Sure. Thanks and good morning, everyone. Let me see if I can achieve this. So I'm just trying to share it properly. Is that filling the screen? I'm not.
We can see the side slides, so you need to put it on.
There we go.
Speaker mode. Perfect. Thank you.
Right. So just by way of introduction, my name is Jason Oprosky. I am a principal economist in the Competition Commission. So just in terms of background or context, as many people know, the Commission engaged in enforcement action around price gouging as the lockdown took place and COVID-19 first hit us. And at the same time, we've seen an economic crisis that's come with the health crisis that hits the poor hardest. But what we see in price gouging and natural disasters, or in the case of a pandemic, is that the poor are generally hit the hardest. And when we look at food, it's really a large part of the poorest's consumption basket, as Mervin's also been showing that food is a significant part of the consumption basket. So in this context, we began to monitor prices of essential foods, partly because our price gouging mandate was really around essential products. So we also looked at essential foods, because we anticipated also that in terms of the economic context, this may amplify certain market features or market failures that could result in consequences around food prices. So as part of this essential food price monitoring, we've released 2 reports, one in early July 2020 and one in September. And what we've tried to do, and we're learning as we go along as well, I suppose, is try to track food prices, trying to look at both wholesale and retail, try to understand what's happening and why it's happening. And today is really going to focus on some of the conclusions, obviously short timelines. I'll try and just highlight some of the interesting points. So I think the initial observations is the first thing we saw around the COVID-19 time is there was an initial increase in commodity prices. So right at the level of grains, wheat, maize, and rice. This was driven partly by a weakening exchange rate at the time. And it was also driven by a lot of other actions in other countries. So there's some export restrictions in certain countries which limited supply, which meant that prices rose in the commodity markets, which obviously would flow down into our food markets. But in terms of our initial conclusions here, and I'll go through some of the data, hopefully some interesting visualizations, is we have observed in that, and this is consistent with what Mervin was saying before me, is we did observe panic buying behavior or increased demand around the initial lockdown, which is around late March, early April. And we saw large price increases, especially where we tracked this. And this is one of the areas we initially started looking, was the Johannesburg fresh produce market, which is the biggest fresh produce market in South Africa. So we started there in a sense, and I'll show a graph on the next slide, but we saw initial increases in these wholesale fresh produce prices. And obviously we saw fresh produce as an essential product or essential food. We also see evidence of this in the Stats SA data around the same period. And what we see since this period of March, April, as a general point, is we see that wholesale prices have subsided or normalized in a sense. But the latest data that we observed does show that there's some stubbornness in retail pricing. So while wholesale might have corrected in a sense to the extent we can see it, retail prices show a little bit more stubbornness on the downward side. And I think that's also consistent with with what Mervyn has observed as part of the EJD. And another, I think part of this process started out as understanding COVID-19 and what happened and how it's affected food markets and what features of the market this reveals to us as economists. We've also started to delve more deeply into food markets more broadly to understand it and to understand what issues there might be, because obviously an event like COVID-19 and the lockdown, it begins to tell you certain things about the market, how it works, where there might be market power, market failure because of that shock to the system. So we've had a general observation here that when it comes to retailers, especially what you find is when there's a cost shock like COVID-19, you find that price increases go up in advance of the cost or come up very quickly. But when those costs come down, so say wholesale prices to those retailers are coming down, the retail prices seem to come down slower. So quick to increase and slow to come down, and which does point to something going on at a retail level, some level of market power that they have. So just to highlight a few slides, hopefully I won't go over my time. So in terms of the Johannesburg fresh produce market, what I've highlighted here is just very quickly is the top 5 vegetables by volume. And this is over the period of March to September. So we track daily prices and then put them into a database to graph them. And so the tomatoes line, which is the gray line, can be a bit distracting. But if you look at those 5 top vegetables, in 4 of them, in all of them, there's a clear spike in prices around late March, early April. But potatoes, that sort of spikes and then carries on increasing across the period. But what we've observed is initially in that March-April period, we saw big spikes in pricing at the wholesale level, whether this is panic buying or something related to that. And then in some sense, these wholesale prices have normalized since that point. But we did observe that shock to the system at the wholesale level, which likely would have been driven by some kind of panic buying behavior. So the next sort of graph I want to highlight, and these are really sort of backing up the initial points I made on that second or third slide. So this is an example from looking at Stats SA data, so looking at the producer price versus the consumer price, so wholesale versus retail spreads. And what you'll see here is the blue line is the producer price. So it's effectively, as we understand from Stats SA, this is really driven by or captured through the fresh produce markets across the country. And then the orange line is the retailer prices, which they track. So this is an example of onions, but we see it with a couple of the big products, but not all products. And perhaps also just to say, maybe to take one step back, in terms of the Johannesburg fresh produce market, we saw this in the top vegetables, but we went to fruits and other products, it wasn't as evident, this jump in the beginning. So it looks like the panic buying or the impact of COVID-19 was really around the essentials. So this is potatoes, tomatoes, onions, carrots, and my camera's just blocking me with the last one, cabbage. So just to say that, we did see maybe some spikes in things like ginger and garlic, but it's less clear. Sorry, so just to go forward again. So you'll see that graph, there's a very clear spike in that orange line, which is the retail prices around first in April and then in May coming through and then coming down again in June. But, and you can see that gray bar is the sort of price difference. So it's the margin between those two lines. So what you see is in that initial COVID-19 period or initial lockdown period, you see retail prices spiking, but wholesale prices coming up, but not anywhere near the same extent. And while there's been an easing of prices, we'd be interested, and we'll do it in our next report, to see, as that pricing data is updated by Stats SA, to see if those retail prices come down, do they come down enough? Is the margin between wholesale and retail restored, or is there some stickiness in that margin? And that's something we want to look at and understand from the retailer behavior of the retailers. So just in terms of fresh produce markets more broadly, is what we did find is that we had some complaints initially as the Commission in that period around fresh produce. So we saw a lot of complaints in often smaller towns for things like tomatoes. We got a couple of complaints, eggs, but a lot of the kind of a lot of complaints around fresh produce markets, or at least a few. So what we did want to do is try and understand these fresh produce markets a bit more, but also try understand what was happening in more outlying areas, because obviously Stats SA, it's usually a bit more urban, it's usually a bit more centralized. So we wanted to understand all these fresh produce markets across the different municipalities. So what we did is we got some data from DAF, which they carry, so you can get 90 days of data, which is quite detailed, across 18 fresh produce markets that we could get, and across all the different products that are on there, and different classes and varieties and pack sizes. And so I just want to highlight a couple of conclusions. I'll highlight one figure here and there, but obviously there's more detail in our reports. But I think the first thing we find is surprising in a sense was that there's a high degree of pricing variation across different markets, different municipalities. So there's a graph there for onions, and full disclosure, the y-axis starts at 4 Rand, which I said as an economist I would never do, but I've done it here. But you see there's quite a big difference between the highest price market and the lowest price market, from sort of 4 Rand 50 to 6 Rand 25 as an average price across the period that we looked at per kilogram. So there is a large degree of variation across markets, and we see that across all the products, not just onions. So onions is an example here. So that's what we wanted to do as the Commission, in terms of understanding these markets and understanding what's happened, is to try and understand the reasons for that. So we've done some looking at the data, but what we found is that these differences in prices aren't driven by our sort of first two suspicions. So it's not driven by market size. We find often the largest market has the cheapest price, sometimes the smallest market has the cheapest price across a specific product. It's really quite varied. There's no relationship between the size of the fresh produce market and the price. You might have thought that larger markets with more liquidity have lower prices. It's really not evident. The second thing we thought this could be, or the driver of this, would be transport costs. So we thought maybe, look, these differences in prices between different markets are reflective of logistics cost distribution. So we did a few looks at this, but for example, one thing we do is we said, look, if we look at a product like apples, we'd expect apples are primarily grown in the Western Cape, some in the Eastern Cape. So we'd say, look, our hypothesis is that you'd expect that if transport costs or logistics are the issue here, that you'd get the cheapest prices at the Cape Town market. Our assessment shows that this is not the case, that Cape Town is actually one of the more expensive markets, although Port Elizabeth, which is in the Eastern Cape, is the cheapest. And we even went down into a variety and pack size level with the Cape Town market to try and understand if there was something else there, more expensive varieties or something like that in Cape Town. And for the most part, the majority of all the looks we took, Cape Town was really at the expensive end of the market. And we did that with a few other products, I think bananas and something else. But there wasn't a clear answer in the data that says these differences across markets are about transport costs. And so we don't necessarily have the answers there yet, but it was something that we found was interesting in looking at these in more depth. And the other thing we found here is something we expected, but there were some exceptions, which was interesting, is we found that there was greater price volatility in smaller markets. So smaller markets are less liquid, so you expect there to be a bit more volatility, which is what we saw. And this lack of liquidity in these smaller markets is a concern for the Commission. We've seen internationally there have been a number of cases now in food and other markets around commodity market manipulation. We can't always just assume these kind of markets are supply and demand and everything works out fine. We know that there are always, or let's say there are often opportunities for actors in these markets to manipulate or distort. That's the world we live in, and we've seen that as the Commission. So while the smaller markets do have a lack of liquidity and they are more, the prices are more volatile, what we did find is there were instances of these smaller markets where that volatility was not evident. So where prices were more constant and predictable. And that is a cause for concern for us, why you'd have those different observations. A market that is more consistent or predictable, when most small markets are quite volatile, does suggest that something else might be happening in those markets. So that did give us cause for concern and something that we're looking at more. so just in terms of conclusions, I think for us, we say this with some caution. As I read this, maybe it's controversial, but I think for us, we feel that there's little concern for lasting effects of COVID-19 in terms of food prices at the wholesale level for essential food. So what we've seen is some sense of normalization, and even the initial impact was really on the most essential foods that we could see. And we've also seen in terms of commodity markets, those have normalized to some extent as well, if there is a normal. So at a wholesale level, we have less concern. Where we do have concern is at the retailer level, from what we've observed with that pricing not coming down as quickly. So we're observing that, and we're also glad that there are bodies like the EJD, which are also looking at this in detail and observing what's going on. Our other conclusion, like I said, is this pricing dynamics in fresh produce markets aren't clear. I mean, fresh produce markets are important. They're an important input into the consumption basket, what the poor eat, what everyone eats, but especially, of course, we're concerned about those with less resources who can't afford the most expensive foods. So those pricing dynamics aren't always clear. And I'm sure I'll have some comments from Francois Knowles, I think is following me, following the presentations later. And then also this volatility in smaller markets that we see, but it's not without exception, which is our concern. So that's where we are, I think, as the Commission. This is I think in some sense, learning as we go, in a sense, in the midst of all the other work that we've had to do with price gouging and the pressures of the lockdown period. But we'll also be very open. This is a new body to me, a new group, so we'll be very open to comments and suggestions on how to do this and what we look at. I think the next report, we're looking to look at meat and dairy. There are lots of issues in the dairy market. And we're looking to take some of these conclusions and develop them further, and also look at some of the retailers' results to understand, have they been doing well on groceries or not? Obviously they've taken a hit on alcohol and cigarettes, but looking at food, the initial look is that it might not be, they may have done better than in previous periods. But maybe I'll stop there. I'm sure there'll be questions later. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Jason. That was very interesting and insightful. Apologies from my side, some technical gremlins here with Telkom in terms of dropping us out. But very interesting that you're seeing such strong variation in prices between the different geographic areas, and that there seems to be a disconnect between what's happening at the wholesale level and what's happening at the retail level. So it seems like there is something going on there, and we hope that you'll be able to shed some more light on that as time goes on. And as you alluded, to possible collaborations going forward, part of our intention with this platform is also to facilitate the development of connections and alliances. So I'm welcoming any participants on this call who are interested in collaborating further on thinking about how this kind of food price monitoring can be coordinated more effectively, new methodologies can be integrated, and also made useful to different stakeholders and accessible to stakeholders, so that there is a greater possibility of impacting on these mechanisms of price formation and of preventing any unfair exploitation of the circumstance. So thanks a lot, Jason.
Thank you.
I'd like to now invite Andrew Partridge. Andrew, are you?
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, Andrew, we can.
Okay. I think Florian might have frozen. Okay. Oh shit. Let's do this. There, is that sharing okay?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Okay. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to present here. My name is Andrew Partridge. I work at the Western Cape Department of Agriculture. I specifically work in macro and resource economics. So mainly I have a lot of my work is looking at the sector trends and looking at that kind of broad picture. But we're often required to do impact assessments. So we're having to look at what the price trends have been to assess what that's going to be going forward. And then obviously when with the pandemic this year, it became one of the main issues we had with ensuring that we were getting enough food to people was making sure that the food prices didn't behave too crazy. Or alerting if they did. So just my presentation, I'm just going to give a brief introduction, then just give a few methodological notes on price data. It will be more general things when we look, I find when we're looking at price trends, more so than issues with a specific data source. And then I will look at some recent food price trends, just using Stat2Say data that we've been looking at. Just to kind of highlight some of the issues previously spoken about. And then I'll show some information sources we use for price data and then conclude. So the crux of it is centers around food security, and in '96 this was defined as at the World Food Summit, when they had 4 pillars: your availability, accessibility, utilization, your nutrition, and sustainability. I think it's been expanded since now. But the basic concept is that everybody has access to food, that they can access it, and that it's sufficient, not just enough food, but it's nutritious food to be able to live a healthy lifestyle. And it's produced in a way that's sustainable going forward. If we look at the Western Cape, so this is the hunger levels reported, we see they've been relatively high over the past few years and haven't really come down. So it's, if you look, you might say looking at 2017, 2018, that it's come down a lot from 2015, but actually the people reported still experiencing hunger is still higher than it was 10 years ago. This was came out of the NIDS-CRAM, so as expected with the restrictions that happened, with the economic slowdown, people had less access to food. So we've seen that those hunger levels got up quite high. And we did see, so between the May, June, the beginning up till July, August, there did seem to be a decline in hunger levels. However, they still remained at very high levels. And particularly high percentage saying they had periods where they didn't have enough money to buy food over April and June. Okay, so just the methodological notes. So there's multiple ways which people can report on price data changes, and we see it reported in different ways. And it's important to always realize what you're receiving when you're being reported on. And I'll get more into that in a bit. And we see prices are volatile; they don't move. Certain trends, economic series will move in much more linear manner. They're nice and smooth. Prices are not smooth; they jump around a lot, and we need to realize that when looking at trends. They're also heterogeneous. You see trends that happen for one product isn't the same happening in another. They can move in completely opposite directions. And so these more aggregated trends, they should only be used as very indicative, and we really need to get down to the bottom of what's happening at the specific industry level. Prices are very responsive, so they respond to, first thing we learn in economics, your equilibrium price determined by supply and demand, then you can get shocks, price changes, and then supply and demand shifts. So we see the important role it plays. They also respond to so many different things that happen in the economy, different activities that happen, different shocks that can affect prices. And then the last point, which I'm not really going to get into in this because it's a whole issue in itself, is that your consumer prices and your producer prices are different. They will move differently. And these price transmissions between how price shocks filter through the value chain are very important. And they're also not as simple as just as the consumer prices and the producer prices. We saw in the previous presentation the differences in retail and wholesale. There's also a whole host of activities that happen within the food system between the different stages of production, and shocks that happen at different stages there can lead to diversions between these two different price trends. When price generally gets reported, so the main index, the consumer price index, what we see is you get your, in the reports that come out, you get the percentage changes monthly, and you get a percentage change year on year. And so you're basically just looking at the change between two data points. This just looks at the, so if we look at the general trend, we do see it over a long period. It does look like it's quite nice and linear. You see kind of a bit of fluctuation around the upward trend, which is inflation. And I think since more recent years, when we've had inflation targeting, our inflation has been kept more or less intact in terms of overall. So what we see, if we look a bit closer, there are a few blips where it varies quite far away. We see in 2015, 2016, and then definitely again in 2020. If we zoom in a bit closer, you can see that again, you can see the impact of the pandemic on overall prices. Actually led to a quite sharp drop in prices as measured in total items. But we also saw that it recovers quite significantly and almost gets back to the linear trend. So another way of looking at this is, if we want to compare the movements over the year, is to, if we could rebase the January from each year, and then you can overlay each year on each other. So then you can kind of see how the prices progress over the course of a year. So this is every year so far, and if we look, that last line shows 2020. So you can see there was a sharp drop, but there was a definite recovery period, and it got back to almost up to the trend we've seen, almost back to the prices as would have been expected if there was no pandemic. What this also means is, if we're reporting on just point-on-point changes, if we did month-to-month changes, we would, in July, we would say your prices have gone up so substantially, there's been huge price increases. But actually what we're not considering is that that's just a corrective measure from it going down in the months before. Similarly, if we looked at just year-on-year changes for June, we would probably get very low prices compared to June previous year. Whereas that wouldn't account for the recovery. And if we did July, then we wouldn't actually account for that drop that happened in prices between March and July. At the provincial level, we don't see much difference. The provincial overall price trends generally move in sync with each other. In recent years, the Western Cape prices have increased more faster than other provinces. And again, doing that rebasing to January each year, you see the Western Cape. This is just for each province rather than each year. Then we can see that this year the Western Cape price increases were more than what was in line with the rest of the country, but they all moved in the same movement. There's a very similar pattern. Food prices, again, we can look at this long-term trend. We see it moves less. It has a bit more sharp jumps and drops, but again, overall it does follow this upward path. But yeah, it's definite points which you don't see in the headline inflation, where it picks up quite sharply. And so if we look, this is on the food inflation now, doing rebasing, we actually see that the overall food price increases as measured by Stats SA, the index has moved very much in line with what's been experienced in other years. So it's just straight down the middle, which is quite interesting. Then, but then if we break it down into commodity groups, we start to see that it changes quite significantly, and there's a lot of different movements. This is just into very broad groups, as was allowed on since 2008. I think we have this breakdown by Stats SA. And yeah, so this is just over the last previous year. So very, very different changes. We see some prices going up, some prices going down. Particularly interesting, so this is since 2017, it's just the last 3 years. And just to highlight this is fruit prices. So we see, like, even before this year, there was very big ups and downs happening in food prices. So it would drop and then go up and drop and go down. It's in line with the seasonality within the different commodities. So then if we rebase, if we look at fruit each year, we kind of get this movement. So you see it, the general movement increase a little bit, then you get a drop through to the, in the middle of the year as prices come down, then they increase again at the end of the year. So fruit prices this year, what's happened is the initial beginning part of the year, they've increased, but not much more than they have usually, but we haven't had that same drop in prices that we have had in previous years. So what you're getting is these, so if you go back to this, you're getting these very big year-on-year changes. If you went back to the same point as we are now in 2019, you see it was before they had that big increase. So you're getting year-on-year increases of something like 30%, but actually it's not the case that the prices have gone up. It's just that it's more that they haven't dropped as they have in previous years. Another way of looking at it is you can take the monthly percentage change, and compare that to the average over the last decade. So if we did this, and again, you can see that there's a lot of movement. Even if you take the average, you see it goes up and then it goes down, up, down. And there have been a few moments where the price this year has moved very differently to where it has in previous years. Particularly if you look in May, usually in May there's an increase in the price, whereas there was a drop, but that drop was actually more because there was an increase in the previous year where there's usually a decrease. And so if you track it back like this, you can paint a pattern and explain a bit more why you're getting some of the change that you're getting. We can also now, within stats SA, look at specific commodity groups. So, and I couldn't fit all the labels on, it breaks it down. I think there's about 130 different food groups now. But what you can see is there's no uniformity at all. Some they drop very low over the years, some they go up, some jump up and down, some move more flat. So they're very different. And so when we're looking at this, your average food prices, you're picking up the average of that mess there. It gets weighted for the importance of different commodities, but you can see that you're picking up the different movements that are canceling each other out. So again, highlighting the importance of going actually into the details of the data. This just does the same thing with rebasing it. So you can again see all the different movements. Then if we look on this, we might say broccoli and potatoes, a bit more and a bit less than other ones. But actually then if you look at it, broccoli did move quite differently. You can start comparing this to the last few months. You see that there's usually a decrease now, whereas actually what happened this year, it's increased. With potatoes, even though there was a sharp drop, we saw that's just very much in line with what's happened in previous years. Okay, I'm just going to go very quickly through the last few slides to finish in time. Just data sources, Stats SA's data I've shown, you can get it through their website. I use that quite a lot for picking up more longer term trends as well. And we have a license with TechnoFresh, which is where we get data on current data actually happening at specific markets around Cape Town. You do need a license for it, but we also do then produce a monthly reports on all the vegetable prices. So it gets published each month showing the current prices from that, just on the Cape Town market. And if anyone's keen to be included on that mailing list, please just let me know. I'll share my contact details, or you can get them from the organizer. And then there's also DAF have also an online platform which is free to create an account for, and then you can actually get current data at the different markets as well. The web address is there at the bottom. Then we also have our own databases of certain products that actually gets recorded manually. So we have with beef, we actually have up-to-date data going way back of frequently updated prices, different beef not just beef prices, but actually looking within the different classes of beef. And then we get a lot of our data from industry associations and trade data, and also we can get international prices from different trade data platforms. Okay, so just to conclude then, there's a lot of price information out there. There is a lot of data there. I think it's not really a case of not having enough data. It's more knowing how to access it and how to use it. I think we do need to be very careful on how we interpret price movements. They can lead to misleading assumptions if we don't actually take a much broader picture. And there's very strong evidence that there is price volatility, trends are different for different commodity groups. As I mentioned, just doing a simple point-to-point can be very misleading. We need to first say what normal movement is before we can say that some movement is a good or bad movement. So in order to do that, we either need to actually have this more detailed picture, as I try to paint out here, you can actually look at the longer term trends, or we need to actually adopt more technical quantitative approaches to control for that noise. I think price monitoring is a very valuable tool in terms of market movements. It not just in terms of the price itself, it's important, but it signals other things that are happening in the economy as well. In terms of the economic activity happening, it's very informative. It also, in terms of the equity issues, which was spoken about now quite a lot, is the poor people getting worse hit with the price changes, and price monitoring is an important tool. We need to try and prevent that from happening. But price monitoring itself, I think, is not a particularly well-defined objective. It's a very broad term, and there's so many things you can go into with it. I think if we're going to do it, it needs to be a more defined objective, kind of why you're doing it, what exactly you're going to do with the information at the end of it, what's being measured, what exactly is it trying to pick up? Is it price increases that are too high, price increases that are too low, just that are too different? How you measure it, how you control it will then stem from that. And then if you're going to do it as a price monitoring thing, it needs to be a system which you can update regularly with minimal human effort. So it needs to be a systematic thing that you can get going from that point. And I think just finally, public-private partnerships are really key. The private sector is very good at analyzing price data, at using it effectively, because their business depends on it. And so having those partnerships with the private sector, between private sector, government, and academia are going to be key for any kind of price monitoring initiative. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Andrew. So for me, what comes up here is that there are, evidence for prices going down, prices going up, but sometimes not coming down again in the way that they did in previous years in this case. So that seems an interesting thing that confirms some of what Jason said. I think it's really useful to look at different data sources here as well, and to see if there are different ways of integrating these methodologies, such as the one that PMB EJD have used. So now we've invited various panelists to speak also, and we're going to show some of the questions that we would like them to engage with. We've given them a far larger set of questions, actually, and we've actually cut that short a little bit for the sake of the presentation, so that we don't get tied up into very complex questions and discussions. But the panelists have a broader list of questions that I sent them as a kind of inspiration. And the invitation is for them to speak to these things briefly. All right, so let's see, which of our panelists would like to speak first?
I can go, Flo, if there's no one else that wants to go.
Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity to participate, and thank you to all the presenters for very interesting perspectives. So just as a background, my name is Marlene Lau, and I'm a lecturer at the University of Pretoria in agricultural economics, but I'm also involved with the Bureau for Food and Agricultural Policy, and they are also involved with certain food price monitoring initiatives. More specifically, we have also similar to what Mervyn talked about, a basket of goods that we monitor based on data from the income and expenditure survey. So we use that as a benchmark for how households or what households consume, and then we track that in addition to what it would cost for a healthy eating basket as prescribed by the National Department of Health. So I think we've seen similar trends to what the presenters have discussed here. I would just maybe like to highlight some of the underlying issues that we picked up on during our time in monitoring these baskets. So first off, I think our initial reaction to steep food price increases is to villainize the retailers. But there's sometimes market forces at play that's not very clear and also not very easy to gauge. So first off, I would maybe like to comment on the risk that retailers face, especially in the context of stocking fresh produce in a time like COVID when it's very uncertain. So in our conversations with certain retailers, certain products like cut butternut or cut carrots, that's usually quite popular, didn't really sell during those initial times of the COVID lockdown, be it that consumers had a perception on that it's easier to preserve things that has not been processed, or because they didn't have money, or they had more time to actually process it themselves. But then the retailers had no way to gauge what these changes in expenditure patterns would have been. And so they actually faced a significant risk of stocking certain products. So I think that's not something that's easy to measure, but that would definitely be something that would be reflected in a final price, right? So that's maybe my first comment. And then other issues that might be easier to judge at face value is the effect of administrative prices that has been increasing. So I know in April or in June, depending on who services you with electricity, there would have been a price increase for electricity. And all these factors contribute to what we see in final retail prices. So we shouldn't just link wholesale to retail and then judge that relationship, because that is only part of the puzzle. So I think I've said a lot. I'll mute myself now for more comment.
Thanks, Marlene. That was an interesting contribution. So hearing what you're saying is that there's certain products that were risky to stock during the initial uncertainty after lockdown, but also that there were administrative costs that were perhaps unanticipated and which are also part of the price formation there. And that it's important to keep an eye on these various different factors that contribute to the price formation. I'd like to invite Refilwe, please, to speak next, if she's on the call.
Hi, Florian. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this. And also thank you to the presenters for very insightful and fascinating presentations. I'm actually just to respond to the comment on how there's a tendency perhaps to maybe villainize the corporate sector. I thought some of the stuff that's been highlighted, for instance, in Jason's presentation around price gouging was really interesting in terms of the variations between what's happening at the wholesale and what we see happening at retail level. For me, that raises questions about obviously where these costs are being absorbed in terms of the price formation, and particularly what the National Agriculture Council has reported with regards to the price of maize and also wheat. If we think about farm gate prices that have declined for maize, but on the shelves, we're seeing price hikes for these. So for me, that raises a lot of questions around that and whether or not these changes ever benefit the consumer. But more specifically, just a bit of background also before I get into my contributions. My name is Rafila Jwala. I'm from PLAS at UWC and also part of the C19 People's Coalition. And at the onset of lockdown in April, the Food Working Group initiated a role of the food corporate work stream, which has proposed a special dividend tax and or an expanded price controls. So we looked at different options, and our entry point was to see really that we ended up going with was to see like what's being done in terms of price monitoring and what channels government could possibly intervene in that regard. And so our entry point for this analysis was the price controls, but from a right to food perspective, particularly when we think about the fact that South Africans across urban and rural settings are essentially net food buyers. So access to food, which is constitutionally recognized in South Africa, essentially hinges on affordability. And so our argument in the article you mentioned was that essentially that the government has to take greater interventions for price control in order to, and part of that also involves looking at also what's happening in terms of the social grants. As Mervyn mentioned, if we look at the basic the low wage incomes per month, and we look at the food poverty line, which is, I believe, sitting at 535 this year, we see that all the social grants, the child grants particularly, fall below this, and that basically the average low-income South African cannot afford to purchase enough food to feed themselves and their family. So a couple of things that I wanted to highlight from our article is that across the board, I see everybody's obviously relying on the Stats SA headline urban CPI, and I think it's important, and I think Mervyn may also be able to speak more on this, the fact that Stats SA has explicitly cautioned about their new price collection strategy, which for April was obviously severely impacted by lockdown regulations, and also excludes smaller retailers. So the CPI is not really reflective of what's happening in food markets, not only because they were using online prices, so not only those in the informal economy, but also smaller retailers within the formal sector as well. And so evidence of large price increases on essential foods was obviously not properly captured. I've talked about the issue around farm gate prices having dropped quite significantly. The harvest for maize this year in South Africa is said to be the second highest on record. So it's still sort of like baffling why the price of maize on the shelf continues to go up over this period. And also around bread prices, yes, there were concerns around wheat imports, given obviously the closing down of borders and other logistical issues in terms of the distribution side of things. But actually now with the reopening of the economy, South Africa is only going to be importing 20% of what is needed in terms of wheat for our consumption. So it's still unclear why, like I said, for me, and maybe others can explain and help us understand why we continue to see these price hikes on the shelf. And then in terms of the state regulation that we're calling for together with colleagues at the Center for Competition Regulation and Economic Development at UJ and other colleagues from UCT, basically it's difficult to basically bring these cases up to the Competition Commission and for the Commission itself to take action on these, because food prices during COVID specifically and the case for excessive pricing has been particularly difficult to monitor and to measure, because the 3 months preceding the lockdown in March included seasonal peak, particularly when we think about fresh produce. And furthermore, the issue of discounting on a monthly or weekly basis makes it difficult to properly assess the price formation and to also isolate where the costs are being captured for the foods where we've seen price hikes. So for us, this actually provides the basis then for government to take greater steps to regulate the sector. And what we saw at the onset of the lockdown with the list of foods that the National Consumer Commission is said to be watching, and we also have the VAT zero rated basic foods. Our argument is that if you compare these two food baskets, as well as the CPI food poverty line with the PNB household food basket, you see how these other food baskets actually do not contain some of the core basic foods of low-income households. So really, they're not protecting the consumer needs of low-income households, and they show how basically there's still sort of like a poor understanding of the diets and of low-income households in South Africa. And as a result, we continue to have this poor targeting in terms of the government interventions that are in place. So from that perspective, really, in the article, we were basically calling for the urgent expansion of the National Consumer Commission list, which consists of 22 products, 11 of which are food products. But for instance, sugar beans, which are an important source of protein for low-income households, are not there. Brown bread, which is a staple for all South African, not just low-income households, is not on the list. And a list of a host of other food items, particularly food items that are required for food preparations, including cooking oil, foods and so forth. So we were basically calling for the expansion of this list, because what then happens is that when you have such a list that doesn't contain food preparation items that are required for food preparation, that burden also then disproportionately falls on women. And it's women who are constantly having to negotiate basically these very hard conditions in order to feed themselves and their families. Thank you. I'll park it there for now.
Thanks, Refilwe. Yeah, you've gone over time, but your contribution felt so important and insightful that we've cut you a lot of slack there. And I think you've made some really important points. What I'm hearing is that the way that the state is measuring food prices is perhaps not very effective in representing the needs of poor people and particularly of women. But also you are arguing for a much stronger interventionist role of the state. And I think this challenges some of the kind of neoliberal narrative around the free market economy and allowing it to self-regulate, which is perhaps the underpinnings of the competition regulations, which make this assumption that the market should be able to regulate itself to a large extent, and prevents different retailers also from speaking with each other around prices, which is part of the reason why we don't have any of the big retailers here on this call, even though we reached out to them. So thanks, Lefiliwe, for that very useful insight, or the many insights that you've shared there. And I'm hoping that other speakers will take up some of those points and respond to them as we go forward. Now, I'd like to invite Francois Knowles of the Agricultural Produce Agents Council to give us some of his perspectives as a registrar of the agricultural produce agents. Francois, are you still on the call?
I am indeed. Thank you very much, Florian. I trust you can all hear me. Good morning, everybody.
We'd like to see you too.
Okay, let's do that. There we go. Good morning, everybody. My name is Francois Knowles. I'm the registrar of the Agricultural Produce Agents Council. My primary role is to regulate agents in the following areas or industries, if you like. First and foremost, fresh produce markets. I regulate all livestock agents, and I also regulate all export agents. This is an industry in excess of about 130 billion rand per year. So we are pretty active, and we work really hard to make sure that, amongst others, we look after the farmer, and then, of course, the price mechanism that is at play in this environment. Now, I would like to respond. I've written a million things down, but I'm going to be short and sweet if I can. The one thing that happened to us in COVID-19 was the fact that we started talking to one another. We must acknowledge that. So to this end, we started talking to the Competition Commission, and we talked to Jason and his team right in the beginning of March, when we started hearing the impact of price gouging and the fact that the Commission was looking at that. And we appreciated the fact that we could take hands with the Commission to provide insight as to what we do, how the models work, what is happening across the country. And I think this is a relationship that we will continue to maintain and work on in very, very detail. It's really important that we have that insight as well. So I would like to just talk to what is happening in markets. We must understand the model. The farmer is currently a price maker as opposed to a price taker. That means that the farmer can choose where to send. He can also decide which agent or which market to use. He can also use other facilitation platforms. He can also deal directly with retailers, wholesalers, etc., to the extent that they even sell directly to the informal sector. Now, I hate the word informal sector. We've coined the phrase movable retailers in our environment, simply because we want retailers, all retailers, to go to the next level. If you tag somebody or you label them, that's what they will remain forever. I maintain that the people at robots and street corners, if they catch your eye, you are in trouble because they're going to make a sale to you. They are that good, and we must never ever forget that. So getting to the price mechanism, price formation, we call that price discovery at fresh produce markets. It's very volatile, and it's acutely sensitive to about 45 pricing factors. I'm going to name but a few. Supply and demand, obviously, quality, which is really important in this discussion, continuity of supply, and then communication between the farmer, the agent, and ultimately the retailer and the wholesaler. This is purely a free market system currently at fresh produce markets. There's no fixed baseline. it's important to understand this, because the fresh produce market provides the platform. It provides the necessary facilities, infrastructure, and it allows that trade to actually take place. Now, what many people don't believe, that fresh produce markets have actually allowed a home for small commercial farmers to find a market where the product could be sold. It's a culmination of getting the right people there, people who want to buy at the right time, they get the right price, and pricing is done to the benefit of the farmer and ultimately to the consumer from where we sit. We monitor this from my office every week, so we have a look at what is happening. And I think it's important that we just touch on what has happened across the country ending June this year, 2020. At markets, there was a growth of about 5.48% in turnover and a decline of minus 8.56%. Now that illustrates over a period of 1 year exactly what had happened at markets. Less was sold. This was more evident in the period of COVID-19. We all understand that there was lower volumes provided to markets, higher prices, etc. The ones that we are very interested in currently, we're looking at the potato price and we're looking at the tomato price. Those are very volatile and they are very concerning. If you go and look at the reasons, there was a lot of rain when it started, less were produced, some production areas have not come into play yet, and those things are all very important elements that contribute to why these things are happening. So remember the stats. I like what was also mentioned about how you utilize the information. You can prove anything if you twist the information to your advantage, and I don't think that is healthy. We must be honest, we must be realistic, and we need to work for the good of the industry, for the good of that hungry person that's not getting the food. To me, that is crucial, and that is really important. Now let's just jump back to the farmer. If there's no farmer in this value chain, there's no industry. The reason I'm saying that is simply stability is really important. There's nervousness in the industry when we hear about the Competition Commission, and because farmers tell us that there's nervousness if they hear that prices will be fixed, etc., etc. I'm not going to go into the detail of that. Just remember the cost of farming, and this is on the other side of the coin, is really it's intense. This is something that we probably need to investigate. I like the fact that there was mention made of transport. Transport is but one element that is crucial and that will have an impact on the way going forward. These days we talk about precision farming. These things all come at a cost. There's pre and post harvesting regulations. There's food safety. Everything has a price tag, and this all contributes to the cost that will ultimately be rolled out to the consumer at one point in time. So information is key, right? So I agree with Andrew there fully. Let's use the information correctly. What is then, or let me put it this way: the new is now the new normal. We will never ever work in the same way again. But and this is important. So we should utilize this opportunity to change, and specifically with prices. Let's understand what is happening. Okay, so we need to understand those changes, how we are looking, and this is my final comment. We have to look at the poorest of the poor. In doing so, be very careful to look at quality. We cannot be seen to provide the poorest of the poor with bad quality. And there was this question about what happened to food waste. It's a very interesting question. Food waste actually went down dramatically, and we've got the statistics to inform that discussion. Ultimately, because there was a reduction in volumes presented at markets and food platforms, less sold just simply indicates less waste. So that's the good news. But here's the thing: we can't look at the waste at the end of the value chain. We have to look at those individual key players or stakeholders or key points in the value chain to understand where the waste occurs. Specifically at the farm level, what is the waste? Why is there waste? Why is there indeed waste? What can we do about that? How can we reduce this? And that goes for the value chain as a whole. So let me stop there. Thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you. Over to you, Florian.
Thanks, Francois. Thanks for raising those points and also of bringing us back to our understanding of the foundation of these value chains with the farmers and the various different factors that they have to deal with in producing and in getting their produce to market. We're going to open up the conversation now more broadly. I had invited representatives of the informal sector, SAITA, to be present, but the SAITA representative, Rashida Miller, is unfortunately not feeling well today. So I'm not sure if there are any other representatives of the informal trade on this call. If they are, it would be a great opportunity for them to speak to some of these points that have been raised. I also believe that there are some representatives of the Consumer Goods Council South Africa on the call, and they also are very welcome to contribute and to speak to some of these issues. And then finally, I'd also like to open the floor to any of the state representatives from the City of Cape Town or the City of Joburg or other municipalities as well as provinces who would like to raise any questions or points. Now would be a really good time to do so. And also if there have been any points that have been raised in the text chat that you would like to bring to greater attention, please raise your hands and we'll be able to then give you an opportunity to speak. So please go ahead. Anyone who wishes to comment. Brian, I can see that you're on the call. Would you like to speak? Brian, you're muted.
Hi, Florian, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Great. Thanks, Brian. Thanks for being there.
Thanks a lot. Thank you for inviting us also to these such meetings. Thanks to everyone and the presenters. Look, Florian, it's difficult in our situation because we normally speak exactly what is happening on the ground and not the expectations, but things that are happening. Like I hear that it's better for also informal traders because they are buying to supermarkets and wholesalers and the prices they seem to be normal. But I can tell you, because we also teach our members not to undermine themselves or their businesses because they're doing it on the street. We push them to get the best products. I think farmers, they use the grades. I think there's grade A and up to the last grade. We always push our members to get the best. But I can tell you, even before, it was even worse after maybe the level 3 of COVID. Prices went up. We don't know what happened. I don't know whether people, they're trying to recover or something, but everything, it's just expensive, specifically potatoes. If you look at the prices of potatoes, our members, they've been struggling a lot. Now, it's a pity that all these cities, the municipalities, we are spending, as leaders of the sector, we're spending more time trying to fight for the existence of informal traders while they are kicked out. If it was normal, whereby say the informal sector was accepted and people were given fair opportunity, we would invest our time to go and get maybe a chance to directly buy from farmers. We don't necessarily need to go to these markets. I think it will be it will make a lot of difference, because if you go, like for instance in the city dip, before you can go and negotiate with the actual owner of the stock, there's agent, they also got their own interest and stuff. In a way that we came up with a trick that we teach our members. When they go, they must go there as a group. If they want potatoes, the majority of them, if they're selling fruit and veg, the majority of them, for an example, they will buy tomatoes on a daily basis. So they give one person who will be responsible for that tomatoes, then that person buy in bulks. Then in that way, it's easier to negotiate with whoever that is. But and there's a trick also, because what they do, if ever there is something that just came in, remember we are competing with the big retailers. They go and they don't negotiate for prices and stuff. They just go and buy. So we go there, we wait, and if as long as our members they see the stock is still good, it's in a good condition, they normally don't buy. They go there as early as 4 o'clock. Around 6, maybe they start negotiating. They will buy the stock that they are looking for at 8 o'clock. As much as they go on and negotiating and leaving as if they are not buying, then it works for them. So that's how they're surviving for their price. If you go on the street, they are selling their stuff in a very, very cheaper way than any other retailer. If you go out there, like your fruit and veg, it's simple because of that. We told them to go there and negotiate rather than just go and buy. If ever they are doing that, they won't make any profit. So I'm saying, Florian, if ever really, this is what my conclusion. I'm concluding. I'm concluding.
Thank
I'm
you.
saying if ever we are actually doing that, we are negotiating with farmers directly, whereby our members will be able to go with directly and buy from them than in the markets. Thank you, Lord.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, thanks for giving us an insight into the strategies that the informal traders are using to access good prices. And also that you reflecting that you also noted some price increases during phase 3 and that those weren't entirely transparent. You also seem to be suggesting that there are particular interests and strategies used by agents, which are also not entirely transparent to everyone in the food system. And I think that's also important to bear in mind, that there are so many different parts to the food system and that they are not always operating according to procedures or rules that are apparent and easily understood by everyone. So thanks for that contribution, Brian. And I'd like to ask if anyone else would like to speak or comment. This is a good time to raise your hands. Also, any of the speakers would like to respond to any of the issues that have been raised, you're welcome to do so. Please use the participants function to raise your hand. Jason, I can see you've raised your hand to respond. Please, please go ahead.
Let me unraise my hand. Was it ready? Unraised. Okay.
There we go.
Yeah, no, thank you. I thought I might as well jump in front in the queue. Thank you to all the sort of panelists who've made comments as well. And I just maybe wanted to highlight a few things that have come up that I find interesting, or maybe where I have a bit more information. I think on Marlene's comments around the retailers, I mean, I think it's right in that the sense that, you know, when you monitor food prices, the next thing you need to do is to understand the whys and understand the details. And this, I think, also fits with what Andrew Partridge said. You know, there's data and then there's understanding beneath that data. So I think that's right. I mean, I think that information about cut vegetables at the retailers is interesting, but I mean, I know it's just an example and I'm sure there's more, but if there's something like cut butternut or cut carrot that's not selling, you'd expect them to have to get rid of that to sell at lower prices rather than higher prices. So I'm not sure if it explains some of the pricing behavior. Administrative expenses, it's an important question, and it's important to understand how much that contributes. I think in terms of what Porfirio has said, I think is right. A lot of that is really important. I think perhaps that there a couple things to say. I think one is on value chains. Often with fresh produce, it's a slightly more abbreviated value chain. So wholesale and retail a little closer together, but then you do get some value chains where there's a processor in the middle. And we have seen in certain markets like dairy where there's a concern that perhaps the processing level is where the market power is, and they may be able to capture more profits. And so the farmers are put under pressure and the retailers are saying they're not making margin. So you have to look at the processes. So the nature of that value chain definitely matters. In terms of maize and wheat prices, I mean, obviously we have the challenge that a lot of our prices are impacted by commodity markets and therefore driven by international prices, even if it's an export price. And I think the one thing we do, we had some interaction as the Commission, speaking more broadly with some of the big food companies at the initial part of lockdown, and they had made some initial commitments not to push through some of these price increases that came from commodity markets. So they said, well, not push them through at all, but to delay that. So some of the advocacy the Commission did there resulted in some of those increases were delayed, at least to give a little bit of a buffer in the initial parts of lockdown. So what you might find, and I'm not saying this explains anything, but what you may find is some of those commodity price increases actually flowed into the market a little later. But I mean, as far as I understand, you wouldn't be expecting to see that now. That would have been in the kind of June, July, August area. But of course, the maize prices and maize meal do have to be looked at. So there seems to be a lot of talk about those prices staying high or still increasing. But I think one thing also that Rafiwa picked up on, and it also flows from Mervin's presentation, is that Stats SA does track the main retailers, it's urban CPI, that's the focus. So I think we do lack a lot of information and understanding of what's going on in rural areas, outside of the main centers, outside of the main retailers. That's where we do have a gap in food price monitoring, and which is really important. And I think the Commission has certainly got that feedback. So sometimes we present things, and whether it's a councillor or a parliament member saying, look, in my hometown or the village I come from originally, where my family is, this is not the case. Where we've seen price increases. So there is that. The food market is so diverse, and there's so many sort of small markets in towns and across the country that monitoring all of that is hard. But there are dynamics that a Stats SA won't pick up. So I think that's very true in terms of what Rafiwa said. And so I know I'm spraying comments across all the speakers. I mean, the other thing from Francois, I just appreciate what he's brought, which is really, really interesting. I mean, I think the point about that the fresh produce markets have seen less volume sold for more revenue is really interesting. And I'd really be interested to understand the dynamics, and perhaps we can always take that offline if there's not time as well. I mean, I would have expected with less supply, the prices would have gone up, but not necessarily total revenue. But perhaps part of that's inflationary. I'd be interested to understand that. But yeah, so just thanks to all the sort of panel members for those comments. And I think there is definitely room for more collaboration going forward. Thanks.
Thanks, Jason, for responding to all the different comments that have come up in such a comprehensive way, and also for raising some red flags and areas that are not so obviously understood. So thanks for that. Andrew, I see your hand is up also. Would you like to make a few comments in response?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it was just on the one, I just wanted to make a comment on the Stats SA data issue that was raised. I think I completely agree with what was said. There are issues with Stats SA, with using that data series particularly. And the same with all your kind of aggregated series. If you looked at gross domestic product, fixed capital formation, all these aggregated indexes do have issues with the way they're calculated, with the way the data is collected, just because you are essentially representing a massive system so you need to make these things. But The thing with that to say is it's comparable. You can just they have it by industry. You can break down the South Africa by various things and compare them effectively. And it also gives it gives more a long, because you can look at it, aggregates itself up to annual, monthly, a monthly data, but it does smooth out a bit more. So it does give you that nice point, first point to look at and pick up where these broad trends are and give you an indication of kind of the more general picture. So I would always recommend, my approach would be to start with that, look at the broad trends, see what's going on, paint a picture from that, and then use that also to pick up what the past trend, what's been in the past. Once you've done that, then I think what I was going to say is it's very important to go into the more detailed information. So look at the market level data, look at more like weekly data, even daily data. But once you start doing that, it does the volatility gets more. The more you drill in, the more volatile the price data gets. So it becomes even more important that you report on it correctly, that you account for the normal noise, because there'll be a lot more of it. And then go into more, once you've established a more comprehensive analysis of the data, then go into a more qualitative analysis and look at what's actually happening on the ground, speaking to people on the ground. Then also on the informal, not measuring the informal side, this was something that come up with some of the work I've done. I've kind of tried to grapple with how you measure stuff in the informal sector. And I was recently, a point was made to me that actually, there's not, the informal sector is so difficult to measure because it's informal, it's not regulated, the information is collected, so it's so difficult to measure. That actually there isn't really, we shouldn't get too caught up in trying to exactly pick up exact trends. We're not going to get it. You're not going to get nice price trends like you do for the formal sector, just because the nature of it. But that the informal sector does follow the formal sector, not necessarily exactly like we've seen here, particularly in times of crisis. You get and different factors coming in, you can get big diversions. But overall, in terms of your overall aggregated trends, the informal sector prices will follow the trends of the formal sector prices decrease. The informal sector prices will also decrease. They just might increase by a lot more. They might increase by less. So maybe it's not. We shouldn't focus too much on trying to actually measure it, and just more making. We do have a very strong responsibility to ensure that the informal sector is access to the economy, and I think that's what was the problem in COVID-19, was that they weren't able to access the economy. So I think we need to focus on how they're able to participate in the economy, but measuring them in such a detailed way might be an impossible task. And then finally, just that last point that Francois made about the new currently, I think it was a very important point. And just that to also note that the trends that were happening before the pandemic, with the fourth industrial revolution, with all the stuff that was happening, and then now what we've had to adjust with social distancing, with everything, I think that the importance of data and data intelligence is going to become more and more important going forward. And that the new world that we're going into is going to be one that is a lot more data centered than the one we were in before we went into the pandemic.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, I think the question around monitoring prices in the informal sector, if one can even call it that, and I appreciate that Francois also critiqued the very use of the term, but I think that's a recurrent issue. And I think it also really depends on what kind of products we're talking about. As indicated by other speakers, the informal sector buys some of its produce from the formal sector in terms of big wholesalers and such, particularly with processed goods and staples. But in terms of fresh produce, they are also likely to buy directly from farmers or from the fresh produce market. So I think it's important to have a slightly differentiated perspective of that, and to consider ways of incorporating some element of monitoring at that scale. And I think it's important also in terms of being able to make the political argument for greater accommodation and support for informal trade or street trade, and to not always prioritize the interests of large retailers only. So I think it's something that needs to be looked at. What I'm also hearing is that some of the level at which the data is monitored at a national level, for example, doesn't allow these more smaller scale dynamics to show up very clearly. And there definitely seems to be an argument here for more localized food price monitoring. And I think, again, the PMB EJD approach is quite innovative. And I see Mervin's had his hand up for a while. Mervin, would you like to comment on some of these issues again?
Thank you, Florian. Yes, and just to say thanks to all the speakers and the panels. I mean, I found a lot of extremely interesting contributions. So thank you. I just wanted to speak a little bit to the question of price monitoring for what purpose, I think, which Andrew raised, which I think is really an important one, because it's not just, okay, so what do we want to do with the data? It is also about how do we, who interprets the data? Who interprets the meaning thereof? Because at the end of the day, it seems to us at the PMB EJD that the reason why we are engaged in price monitoring is about having a picture where the households are able to access sufficient and nutritious food. So that's the goal. And does our food system and does our economy allow that? But then if we do that, and if that is the goal, as in our case, then questions such as where do we monitor, who interprets the data, and all of those things become extremely relevant. So they're methodological questions, but they're also questions around power. And how this plays itself out. So, for instance, when we look at a question that we feel were raised around the CPI, for instance. So when we look, for instance, at the food basket within the CPI, so the CPI food, its weighting is somewhere in the region of around 20% of the entire CPI basket. I mean, I might be wrong with a few percentages here and there. But we do know that in the lower income households spend around around 70% of their income on food. So that's the CPI food weight at a lower level. And in the context of extreme high inequality, some of these data figures are skewed. And so it is critical, I think, that we find a way where we can bring in a lot of these different entry points towards monitoring. So, I mean, CPI, Stats SA's monitoring is critical. I'm not bashing it, it is critical. But I think it also needs to be viewed against other data sets. And I think that's where the real issues become important, because for instance, in the discussion around access to sufficient and nutritious food, it's not only about food prices. I mean, women tell us it's about it's about electricity prices. Now, of course, that is outside of the area of food price monitoring, but we also need to, if our goal is to see that there is no hunger and that there is sufficient nutrition, and affordable nutrition, then we actually have to look at some of these other issues. And it's that which makes the whole playing field so complex, in addition to understanding the different value chains, etc. So it's a very complex area, but I think we we are on the way towards something, but I think we just need to begin to bring some of these data sets together so that we can see a real picture of the impact on households in South Africa. And for me, that is the point of price monitoring. And if that is the point, then we need to have that voice present in the room when we interpret that data. Thank you, Florian.
Mervyn, I think those are really, really important points that you raised, just bringing us back to the purpose, but also of raising the issue of the power dynamics involved in the gathering of data, in the interpretation of the data, and also in terms of the evaluation of the data through various different indices. And I appreciate that you've raised the issue of the CPI being essentially biased towards the interests of the wealthier segments of our society. So really valuable to bring in those perspectives, and also to highlight again the importance of ultimately of nutrition. But also what you're bringing up is that this conversation, if we keep it within the confines of the food system and the food value chains, we'll be missing important dynamics as well, as you've pointed out, with regards to electricity and costs of power, costs of transport, and so on. So ultimately, some of these problems stem from our broader economic system, some of the failings of our capitalist system at present. And we have to look beyond the kind of food space to be able to address some of these. So thanks for that, Mervyn. I know that there may still be some representatives from the private sector here. The Consumer Goods Council South Africa had some conversations with them offline about participation in this event. I think they made some really important points in my private conversations with them, also around how the business models work and how food corporations don't necessarily decide prices in a centralized manner. Are there any representatives of the Consumer Goods Council on the call still who'd like to respond, say something around what they've heard so far? Linda, McClough, are you guys on the call?
Hi, Florian. Thanks so much for the presentations. I think we, as the Consumer Goods Council, we are in most cases very welcoming to anyone that wishes to partner with us. And I like the last discussions that we are having now in terms of the models that need to be used, and also who is verifying and vetting the information that is being collected. So we are always open, because we cannot be the master to it all. We are open to working with the various people, and I see there's a lot of food waste discussion that is happening on the chat, which is something that we are looking to partner with various stakeholders. It's not a one-person thing, it's not a one entity thing. It's something that needs to be done at a broader collaborative manner. So that would be our input. Thank you.
Thanks, Matlo. Thanks for reminding us also of the ongoing work around food waste. And just to mention, and I'll pick it up again later, that we are convening a work group specifically around that as well. Any other comments, any other questions that have been raised? I noted some comments, interesting comments in the chat as well. Morgan raised the question around war profiteering and lingering high prices. I think that's something that keeps coming up. I don't know if we have the data at this point in time to resolve that, but there does seem to be some evidence of
Hi, it looks like Flo has frozen again. Unfortunately, he's having connection problems. Bruno, did you have your hand up? Do you want to take the floor?
Yes. Good morning, everybody, and thank you to the present speakers and panelists for the very stimulating discussion. I am Bruno Losch from the Center of Excellence in Food Security at UWC and part of the COP Secretariat. We had many illustrations by the presenters which were about the fresh product market prices. But of course, I was wondering about do we have something similar about the core items in the baskets which were mentioned by Mervyn. If we have most of the spending which comes from maize meal, cooking oil, brown bread, and if I remember well, Mervyn said that there was something like a 9% increase for these core items over the last 7 months. So the question is, what are the price dynamics for these products? Is it possible to have a breakdown of the price increase between the imported price increase, which was mentioned by Jason, related to exchange rate, export restrictions in some countries? So between imported price increase, food price increase at the level of the food processors, and increase at the level of the food retailer. I think that's it's here between the imports or the production, the processing, and the retail that we have the very core dynamics which are at the center of the political economy of the food system in South Africa. So is it possible to dig further, and is it possible to access the data for a deeper analysis on these dynamics on these very core items in the food basket? Thank you.
Is there someone, one of the presenters or panelists that would like to go first to respond to Bruno?
I can't speak on the baskets per se, the specifics of the baskets. Maybe one of my other colleagues could do that, but just to note, the thing with the markets, the fresh food markets, is they have a centralized thing where they record all the payments and everything get prices, and it's a centralized system. So there is already that nice database. That's why we're able to get data that's so up to date. With other aspects, even trade data takes a little while for it to go through to get released from the customs, and your retailer data it depends on when that gets collected. You don't have that same automatic straight to the point data available that you do with your fresh produce markets. Yeah, just a note on that.
Yeah, sorry, can I come in at this stage? And just to say that I had a bit of connection problems. So I don't think I heard the entire question, but it might be useful for Bruno to have a look at our October index to see, at least from our perspective and the retail stores where we have collected the prices, what the average prices there are. And you know, if more information is required, we can always provide that to him. But I lost connection midway through, so I'm probably not fully answering his question or responding appropriately to his comment.
If I just may be more precise, I think it's very important to have a close follow-up of what are the price dynamics for different items. But what seems to me very critical is to understand and to have the breakdown of the price increase itself between the production or import level, the food processing, and the food retail. I think it's the more critical and the more sensitive issue.
Yeah, if I may respond, to what Bruno's saying. I absolutely fully agree with your comment, Bruno. I think one of the issues that was consistent, I think, through all the presentations, I think I heard it in Jason's presentation, I heard it in Andrew's, I think Francois might have mentioned it as well, and that is that our system is not very transparent in exactly the way you are speaking about. So we do have farm gate prices. We do have market, the data from the fresh market. The difficulty is really about accessing how the value increases from that point to the moment it arrives on the shelf. And I think that one of the greatest areas for exploration really is really a study into that, because I fully agree that that is where we are probably seeing most of the price increases are happening at that point between either the fresh produce market or the farm gate and the retail. So what happens at production level? What happens at logistics levels in terms of transport, etc.? We can only surmise, at least from our perspective. And I would be really open to hear what the other panelists, whether such data actually exist. And so perhaps one of the important things is a much greater transparency and even state enforced transparency. I don't think the market in and of itself will just become transparent. I think there is a role for government to take a lead on ensuring that some of that data becomes available so that we can really see how the value is added on and whether the prices at retail actually matches the value of the product that we are buying.
Right, maybe if I could come in as well. So I think Bruno's question is a really good question. I think it's right that price formation along the value chain is not as transparent. So we can observe retail prices. We can sometimes observe wholesale prices. Stats SA is able to track those at a certain level, and sometimes observe farm gate prices. But the kind of interaction between players along the value chain is hard to observe and hard to track. And I think maybe two things to say on this. So at the Commission, what we're looking at now, at least internally, nothing formal yet, is, and what we've looked at through the crisis and various interactions and advocacy initiatives we've had across different value chains is, and something we're thinking about is where does bargaining power on that value chain lie? You often hear these complaints where farmers are saying our profits are being squeezed, retailers are saying we haven't changed anything. So what's happening in between those two sides of the chain? So that's something we are thinking about, and it's an important issue. I think the caution here comes from the Competition Authority that says we do have to be careful with transparency. It can be, in some situations, a double-edged sword where transparency comes with the risk of information sharing, market manipulation, where you've got a few big players and there's a lot of transparency. There's a risk that can encourage some kind of coordination or collusion. So transparency is good to understand what's happening, but we do have to think carefully about how we achieve that transparency and what it means. And I think also to recognize that from the Competition Commission's point of view, is we do have new amendments to the Act that have come in the last couple of years that deal with two important issues here. One is price discrimination, especially in terms of participation. So looking at where you might find a big processor is getting a very different deal to a small processor, or a big farmer is getting a different deal to a small farmer, whether that's justified, and also looking at issues of buyer power. So in some cases, you might find the bargaining power in a negotiation is very much rooted on one side. So you might have, say, a big processor dealing with a lot of smaller farmers, and the processor has the bargaining power and impacts the prices. And you may find these dynamics at different places. So we also have to think about bargaining power along the value chain. So I'm not necessarily sure I've got any solutions for Bruno, but I think in some industries you can kind of triangulate the issue. So you might have the the farmers' prices, you have the retailers' prices, and maybe you have one wholesale price halfway down the chain, and you can understand which ones are moving and which ones not, so you know where to look. But in terms of getting a transparent, regular pricing information across a chain, it has proved very difficult to achieve in the past in various sort of inquiries we've done and research that we've done. It's hard to achieve that.
Thanks. Thanks, Jason, for that. I just also wanted to pick up on that issue and bring it in with another comment, which I saw in the chat earlier, a comment made by Karen Shippey concerning the possibility of using ICT for price monitoring by consumers, particularly also then enabling monitoring of informal trade. And I think it points at a bigger issue is the potential of ICT and things like blockchain potentially as well, of actually tracking and tracing price movements along the value chain. I think the technical possibilities are opening up to gather far larger data sets and far more dynamic data sets on the fly, essentially. And I'm quite keen to see where that's going to go and whether there's any initiatives in that direction to leverage these kinds of technologies to get greater transparencies in a way that actually makes that data accessible. As Brittany pointed out in the chat, in some cases, food pricing data is publicized by government so that consumers have more information, so that the transparency doesn't really only benefit the big, powerful players. We need to wrap up fairly soon. However, I see that Julian Rumbelow has his hand up, and I believe Robert Krieger has raised his hand using not the chat hand raising function, but manually raising his hand on the video. So if either of you would like to speak, please do so.
I saw Robert had his hand up before I did. I don't know if he wants to come in with a point, but in the meantime, I'll go ahead. I think the point that Prof. Bruno Lodge has made around understanding these supply chains better is absolutely critical. My sort of previous career as a risk manager and looking at supply chains and shipping, we studied the Apple industry. In fact, it was my master's thesis. And what we found is that you can, in fact, use the Incoterms, the international trade terms where ownership changes at different points along the supply chain. Also take it all the way to the farm gate. And you can understand where supply chain margins exist. And usually the farmer gets squeezed and someone else in the supply chain benefits. That's kind of generally the story. What we found with the Apple export industry was that even the sort of Covent Garden market prices in the UK, which are sort of the cheapest prices, would produce quite considerable supply chain margins. But where those margins fell in terms of the farmer, the trader, the retail outlet, etc., those were the key questions. And essentially, it is what was happening to the Apple industry in 20 years ago was that farmers were being put out of business when in actual fact the prices didn't justify it. And that was very difficult to observe. One of the issues was also that the Western Cape, specifically from an Apple export perspective, is largely export oriented. Mr. Knowles was mentioning the sort of poorest of the poor and the need to distribute quality food, etc. Such a small portion of the Apple industry is aimed at local consumption that it's quite risky to go into sort of international markets with such a large portion of one's produce. And my sense is that we should be aiming for perhaps slightly larger local consumption, but then obviously people will tell you that the prices aren't good enough. So there are obviously tricky dynamics to work at, but with these international prices fluctuating so much, there's also risk, and it's only ultimately people with deep capital who can absorb those choppy waters. So issues of equity and access obviously become very important. So I think the questions around price monitoring for what purpose are really important. And I do believe that the point made by Karen Shippey about consumer activism in price monitoring is one to really begin to work with. And let's also understand something about what are how much volatility do we want to see, and how do we stabilize some of the price volatility that makes it difficult for smaller businesses to survive in this space. Thank you.
Thanks, Julian, for raising those important points. Also, in terms of who benefits with the current arrangements and who's disadvantaged, and who ultimately takes the margins. I think those are important questions. And also the question around the proportion to which international markets are the destination for local produce, and to what extent that really serves our broader interests of increasing food and nutrition security. And I see from the chat that Chantal has also raised the point around nutrition again, and particularly that even pre-COVID, nutritional behavior wasn't adequate, and that there is need to look at the impacts of food prices on that, given the impacts that the lockdown has also had on the economy. I'd like to invite anyone else who's still on the call to raise their hands who would like to speak. We've got another 5 minutes or so, maybe 1 or 2 people can still speak, but we do need to wrap up pretty soon. Are there any other urgent issues that...
Brian? It's
yes,
Robert here.
Robert. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I realize that the focus has been primarily on the relationship between data and the use of that data. And I see that in terms of the broader discussion around science and policy, which I believe is a very essential issue. However, just listening to this discussion and other discussions which I've tuned in of late, I think the science, policy, and society interface is what is missing in most of the discussions. I think you will recall that one of the webinars the COE had was with the presence of a waste picker, and how they are organized, etc. So here in this instance, I think going back to the example of the PMBEJD would be to have the actual consumer being the one registering the data in a different format, of course, as suggested here, for instance, via a smartphone and GPS. So you can have a much broader coverage of price diffusion across the country. So on the one hand, you have the data being collated for the purposes of, obviously, for analysis of price discrimination or price differentiation, etc. But at the same time, you are encouraging and enabling the agency of the poor and the agency particularly of women, and thereby fulfilling one of the bigger tasks of, for instance, the Center of Excellence, and that is to actually promote citizen science. So I would encourage that we look at also at how we structure interactions of this nature, that we broaden the participation. I do note that you have tried that. And of course, there is always the barrier of language, A, and B, of not only language being used, but the type of language that we use as scholars or scientists. And there we can really learn. Social learning, as you indicated, it's a bilateral, it's a mutual process. So I think just to make the plea that we require in terms of the science policy interface, we need to embrace the society within that space as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Yes, really valuable and important intervention. And as you say, it is something that we are attempting, but for the reasons that you've mentioned, it's a tricky thing, but we are making some progress. And I think it's a really important thing to continue pursuing. So we are approaching the end of the time that is allotted to us for this particular gathering. And I just wanted to also raise, in wrapping up, different possibilities of moving forward with these conversations, and also recent developments. And I'll start with the latter first. I just feel it's a very useful development recently that the Western Cape Economic Development Partnership has pulled together a network of civil society organizations that are at this point in time reconceptualizing their purpose and their agenda going forward, but they are in the process of forming a food forum, which is a very promising development and may help to bring greater coherence to civil society voices within the food governance space, and perhaps also help towards kind of a larger social mobilization around these issues. So that's a very welcome development. Also, I wanted to mention the Food Dialogues report, which has just recently been released. I don't know if Kurt Ackerman is on the call, but excellent work done there, bringing together many different voices and experiences across the food system, looking at Cape Town specifically. And then finally, also wanted to mention that as a result of some of the pioneering work of officials within the city of Cape Town, and an informal food working group that has been established there for the past couple of months, there's been the development of a draft food program, which we expect will be made available for broader comment and review fairly soon. So I just wanted to mention that and to express our appreciation to Tamsin and other colleagues at the City of Cape Town for doing this work and for working towards a more coherent and more transparent governance and management of the food system. So in terms of the way forward, we are very keen to encourage the development of further networks and alliances in the space. If there is interest from participants on the call to develop some kind of a smaller sub-working group to collaborate around ideas of how food price monitoring could be leveraged for more effective governance of the food system at the local level, but also at larger levels, we would invite you to get in touch with us. Send us an email. If there is sufficient interest, we will incubate a small group. We won't be able to play much of an active role in that. We'll be able to help with convening and providing a space for it and perhaps documenting that. But it would really rely on the initiative and energy of participants on the call to collaborate around these issues. Then also a reminder that linked to this is our work on developing policy briefs for the Czech program, which again, we are inviting collaboration. And there might be some call for thinking about whether there's enough interest and value for a policy brief specifically on the retail sector and the food pricing and food price dynamics in that. And we have developed possible other working groups around urban agriculture and civil society and informal trade. These have not really been activated as yet, but if there is sufficient interest, we're going to be following up with those and trying to get more momentum happening within that. And again, to pick up on Robert's point, it is really important that we broaden the participation in these meetings, but also in the working groups, so that they really reflect a more democratic way and a more participatory way of informing policy and also of developing possible joint actions towards more transparent and more equitable, more resilient and more sustainable food systems that can provide the nutritional livelihood and also cultural needs of all people in this country. So unless there are any final remarks, any burning issues that someone still feels like they wish to raise, I'm going to be finishing the call, closing our conversation, and that'll happen in a minute or two. So if there's anything that anyone still wants to say in the last moment or two, please feel free to raise your hands. All right, I see no raised hands at this point in time. So I'd like to thank you all for your participation. I found it very interesting, and we look forward to continuing and deepening these conversations going forward. And please do let any others who might be interested in these conversations know about them. The broader the conversations are, the more valuable we feel that they will be. And also, although our emphasis has been in the Cape and in Gauteng, we are very interested in also branching out, extending our conversations to include colleagues in other parts. I know Chantal is here representing to some extent Bloem and the Free State, but of course there are many other parts of the country which can benefit from this kind of conversation. So please spread the word and invite folks to join. Thank you all very much, and wishing you a really good day further. And thank you to all the panelists and speakers. I forgot to acknowledge you, but of course, this kind of event relies on your participation and your knowledge. So thank you all for taking the time and sharing your insights.